just more than overdrafts. You know, a lot of people feel like December is time to wind the year down and maybe catch up on some things. These regulators, the government has been. I was whining to Diane earlier this morning, like, make it stop. It seems like there's something new dropping every day, not necessarily in the form of like new regulations, but just press releases and things like that. And I tell you what, we've talked a lot this year about fair lending, but overdrafts are making a comeback. They are smoking hot right now. I've got three things that I want to share with you, just information about three things that have come out just in the last couple of weeks. First, I want to start with just kind of give you an overview. The CFPB, they issued 2 data point reports. I'm going to give you a little feedback on those here in just a moment. And then there was a press release that came with those overdraft reports. And I think there's more to that press release than what is actually in the, 100 pages, maybe it's a little less than that, in those 2 data point reports. There's actually the information, that press release is a little more concerning to me, and I'll share some of that here. Some of the biggest banks in the land, Capital One, they put out a press release that said no more overdrafts, free overdraft protection, and they're not the only one, but that's something you're going to continue to hear more about. So there's that. And then just Wednesday, the OCC made a presentation at a conference, and the comptroller made a 10-page statement on overdrafts, and I'll give you kind of some highlights from that here. So let me start with the CFPB overdraft reports. One of them has to do with information that has been collected since 2017. And the reason that 2017 year is important, that's really the last time that the CFPB put out a report or anything on overdrafts. They put out this consumer voices thing back in November of 2017. Then basically, we haven't heard anything since. The report, one of the 2 reports, talks about overdraft fee reliance by financial institutions as far as income and profitability. That goes back to 2015. That's about a 30-page report. And then it talks about banks and their interactions with core processors, another 60-page report. Okay, more to that in just a moment. Those reports came with a statement, a press release by the CFPB director. And I want to just go off on a tangent on him in just a moment. He's really only been confirmed and in office for a couple months. But one thing that, if you haven't noticed, this would be more of something to give to your management teams, maybe your board, kind of at a 10,000 foot level, that it doesn't appear he's afraid to do really anything right now. He's got a big stick, and he's going to swing it. Right out of the gates, he hit with equality and discrimination, setting in place fair lending priorities. A few weeks back, he took some big shots at tech companies, specifically fintech companies and payment systems. And so he's looking to make some waves in that area. And this last week, it was making waves as it relates to overdrafts. Now, his press release, if you read some of the things that other people have written about it, the term that's being used kind of consistently is it's a warning shot to financial institutions. A quote from that warning shot is, the CFPB will be enhancing its supervisory and enforcement scrutiny of banks that are heavily dependent on overdrafts. Now, if you're not heavily dependent on overdrafts, I don't think you're completely out of the woods on this, but if you've got a pretty big budget line as it relates to overdrafts, I think you're squarely in the crosshairs of what they're trying to get at here. So what's that warning shot mean? Well, in the short term, because of the lack of regulation and rules in the area of overdrafts, what that likely means is regulation by enforcement. And that's something we didn't see a lot under the Trump administration or even the different leadership groups at the CFPB while Trump was in office. That appears it's going to change. That regulation by enforcement is going to be back, and it's going to be done largely by consent orders. Financial institutions, you need to be aware of what's going on around you and learning from the mistakes of others. We've trained on this for years, that it's not so much who got in trouble, it's what they got in trouble for, or what is being dictated to them as far as, in this case, how they're handling overdrafts, where they've taken a misstep, or the Bureau believes they've misstepped. And that'll trickle down. It's going to start at the CFPB, and it'll trickle down into prudential regulators, FDIC, OCC, et cetera. The reports themselves, our reading of them, they don't get into specific overdraft practices that are concerning to the Bureau. It's at a higher level than that. It's really, they're taking a shot initially here at the industries and financial institutions' heavy reliance on overdraft income. And then there is a ton of statistics in those reports. as I was reading them, you don't need to read through them word for word, but it reminded me of statistical analysis research papers, unfortunately, that I had an opportunity to participate in once upon a time. It took me back to those days, but there's not one thing in there that's concerning as far as practices. It's more of a higher level. So what do we see next? I believe, and I think others in the industry are probably in the same boat, that this is a precursor to what comes next, and that is that the CFPB's fall regulatory agenda is likely to be out in the next couple of weeks, maybe even sooner than that. And we're all kind of anticipating that overdrafts will land on there in some context. Okay, whether it's research and analysis, whether it's pre-rule, something like that, whether it's a panel, that we anticipate that there will be something related to overdrafts that lands on the agenda. If it's not on the agenda, so I had an audience with a compliance group a couple of days ago, and they asked this question, and so I've added it to my speaking point here. They said, well, what if it doesn't make the agenda? And I said, well, that's probably not necessarily good news. Now, I know what you're thinking, we don't want overdraft regulation, do we? Well, maybe not. If we don't get some sort of change with respect to how it's going today, what it's going to mean, at least in the next 4 years, is regulation by enforcement as it relates to overdrafts. That means they're going to regulate us again by consent orders and the use of largely informal policy guidance that's likely to be inconsistent from one regulatory agency to another. And it also means that it just means rulemaking hasn't yet been initiated if it doesn't land on their agenda. Rulemaking, to take the other side of it, would mean a more level playing field and uniform industry-wide rules. And again, I know you're thinking that's maybe not what we want, but regulation by enforcement is not fair and it's inconsistent. And taking things that happen to the largest banks and applying them to the smallest banks isn't necessarily the right answer either if we're talking about regulation by enforcement. If we come up with some rules that everybody gets a say in and we can get some buy-in and levels the playing field instead of it having it be the Wild West that it is right now with overdrafts, that may help things. Okay, that's just, again, our crystal ball on this a little bit. Many of the largest financial institutions, or many financial, I don't want to just say the largest, have already stopped charging overdraft fees. The most recent headline was Capital One. Just in the last week, they said, no more. We're not charging overdraft fees. We're giving free overdraft protection. They're happen to be the 10th largest bank in the land. Ally Bank, earlier this year, they did the same thing. They're the 18th largest bank. And then I didn't give you some of the smaller ones because you wouldn't know them by name, but there are several others out there. And you don't have to take it from me. I'm going to share with you all in the chat 2 different news articles. One is a Forbes article just in the last couple of weeks. So there's that link. And I'll give you one more. So here's a CNBC. So these are coming from reputable sources. They're not just somebody sitting in an office in a dark place writing things up. These are reputable articles that I encourage you to take and read and pass along this information to your management teams and board, and let them know, kind of what's going on here, that this is smoking hot right now. Nothing is changing as far as anything imminent, but it's coming. In addition to the CFPB stuff that's come out and the Capital One thing and some of these other banks, the OCC, their comptroller, had an audience just on Wednesday, and he had a 10-page statement. You can go out and you can Google that. I don't have a link right for you here, but there was a quote in there that I want to share with you also. This is from the OCC. New rules and the credible threat of enforcement actions for harmful practices should help ensure that at least some progress will be made in the future. So he has obviously had an audience with the CFPB and has a little idea of where they plan to go. He mentions these new rules. That tells me they're anticipating something. And then this credible threat of enforcement actions, well, that goes right in line with the CFPB director's press release. Again, those reports, it's not so much the reports, it's that press release that is the warning shot that should be concerning. So as far as our take on this, I'm going to leave you with a couple points here. Financial institutions, your board, your management teams, you need to know that overdrafts and overdraft income are in the CFPB's crosshairs again. They were there 4 or 5 years ago. They're back in the crosshairs, and we need to plan accordingly. Now, the difference is that last time they were in the crosshairs, they didn't quite get things done before we had a change in administration. Well, now they're setting this up in the stage to get this going right out of the gates, which means they have like at least 4 years or to get this thing done. It's not like they're doing it on the way out. They're doing it at the beginning of their leadership, if you will. So look for things to actually get done this time around. Overdrafts and overdraft related income, as your board and management teams know it today, is likely to change, and it likely will be sooner than later. And it's either going to happen through enforcement and in consent orders or rulemaking. And it's probably a coin toss as far as which may be better as we move forward. So I would say we need to stay tuned. There's likely to be more information. You can look just in the first 10 days of December, what's dropped on overdrafts. We're likely to see a lot more on this topic. So that's my update on overdrafts.
Let me ask you, you mentioned several times over reliance on overdraft fee income. Do we have any percentages what that is?
Yeah, there's some percentages that, like I said, those reports include a lot of statistical analysis. And I remember seeing something like they did a group or a bucket of banks that's like more than 40% of their profit comes from overdraft income.
I mean, that might be in the eye of the beholder, but if there is a metric out there that these folks can look at and say, okay, if we're over 40%, and I see, Brad, you said you also highlighted that same sentence, and this is the thing, pass this on to your exec team, your senior management, board of directors, let them know, you know, this is all, I don't know, it's, as you're saying, it's not defined clearly, right? But our job as compliance officers, as risk managers, is to be that guard that's looking outside and saying, hey, here's a risk and it's coming.